Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. Before I get started, I want to note that we have closed captioning available. You can press the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll give you a moment to do so. And that will give you access to closed captioning. Again, hello. My name is Dr. Lisa Coleman, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Global Inclusion and Strategic Innovation at NYU. And I use she, and her pronouns. Thank you for joining us today for NYU Be Together Global Scholars and Innovators series, a conversation with NYU faculty and students on disability inclusive culture. We're thrilled to host this program, and thank you for joining us. Now, let me begin as I always do. I hope everyone is taking really good care. People keep saying this is the new normal. It is not. There is immense stress, serious illness, health issues, increased care that we have to do for ourselves and for others, and all kinds of challenges. So we really do hope that you're taking really good care of yourselves, your loved ones, and your colleagues. I've been saying that what we need is a new different that recognizes the disparate impacts and the urgency of now, instead of rhetoric, to take action. And as an NYU community, we are moving toward transformation and emphasizing equity in action. We must also continue to recognize the scope of the impact and the disparate impact during this pandemic and continue to prioritize our communal health. I would also like to acknowledge all of the frontline workers, all of the people working in the hospitals, healthcare workers, etc. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I would like to also honor those who are working behind the scenes, those people whose labor is often unseen, undervalued, and uncounted, who continue to sacrifice for our well-being, those who clean the health facilities, sanitation workers, transportation workers, delivery workers, and so many more. All of you essential workers who support us, care for us, and allow us to care for ourselves. Thank you. We know that we could not be without you. I want to remind the NYU community to continue to visit the NYU Returns and COVID information site, where you can continue to access additional information about our plans and the resources available, including wellness resources. Now, before we dive deeper into today's program, I would like to take a moment to honor all of those who've come before us, our ancestors, the lives that have been lost during this pandemic, those known to us and those unknown. And to acknowledge the indigenous peoples whose lands we, no matter where we are, occupy. I would like us also to recognize those who paved the way for us to be here today, including those disability rights activists, named and unnamed. And we also recognize and firmly repudiate and condemn the ongoing crises of anti-Asian and anti-Black violence in the United States. Please join me in a few seconds of silence in recognition, remembrance, and honor. Thank you. This event tonight is part of NYU Be Together, a change-making effort that was announced by our president, Andrew Hamilton, and the Board of Trustees. It is an initiative focused on making global change across NYU's global network by innovating, acting, and transforming together. And we in the Office of Global Inclusion, as we spearhead this initiative, Be Together builds on the Being at NYU assessment in previous years where NYU had the opportunity to voice and reflect on who we are, where we've been, and who we want to be. From this foundational data, we continue to grow, build, reimagine, innovate where we want to grow as a community, use our innovations, and double down on our assets, including our diverse global community. As I mentioned before, COVID-19, the exacerbated inequities, the pervasive racism and racist violence experienced by members of our marginalized and disenfranchised communities, the disparate impacts on women, members of communities, people with disabilities, as well as across the generations, and we've heard of Generation C. The ways in which this pandemic has disparately impacted so many. We need to think about this disenfranchisement and the urgency of the work that we all must do together. It is important for us to make changes now, to transform what we do and how we take action. And again, NYU Be Together is just that, an initiative for change. To strengthen our community by taking actions that advance equitable access and also fosters a sense of coming together for all of our members, coming together in action. At NYU, disability inclusive culture has been a focus for us. Aligned to the 2017 Being at NYU assessment data, today's conversation is an important opportunity to support critical discourse around disability inclusive culture, to move away from just the notion of compliance, and to move toward an asset model that we hope will support the actions and advance disability inclusive culture across all of NYU and beyond. While there has certainly been some progress, we know there's a lot of work still to do. Topics will certainly emerge that will focus on things that we can do here at NYU too, recognizing that we are a vibrant community of people of all abilities, strengths, and needs. I hope that you will go back to your communities post this discussion and take some of the learnings for deeper research and action around some of the themes such as ongoing structural and institutional, interpersonal, and individual ableism and the associated oppressions, evolving understandings, framings, and reframings of diversity of abilities and strengths, focusing on intersectionality and the various intersections of race, gender, ability, sexuality, nationality, age, visible and non-apparent disabilities and neurodiversity, challenging a deficit model toward one that is asset-based, and centering marginalized communities in all that we do. As we engage in our work at NYU to build a more inclusive culture together, I want to emphasize again that we need to take an asset-based approach, understanding that solutions come with diverse, inclusive, and equitable organizational practices that bring forth the best innovations and the most possible. Some of you have heard me say this, but when I look in the mirror, I don't see a problem. I see solutions. When I look at our students and the range of diversity across our students, our faculty, and our staff, and the contributions and the various diverse contributions that they can make, I see assets. We are your assets. In OGI and through our work with Be Together, we are focusing again on action to create more access and more inclusivity, a new different. We have partnered with Tec de Monterrey in Mexico. Thank you to our partners there on International Day of Disabilities, and again for an upcoming program on May 6th. We continue to expand our partnerships in this arena, and we are pleased to see action on national level as well shift. Just today in a USA Today op-ed, where it was announced that activists Judy Heumann and Governor Tom Ridge championed a new COVID relief package that will help people with disabilities obtain the tools and assistance they need to to live and stay independent. They wrote, quote, "The American Rescue Plan, recently passed by Congress and signed by President Joe Biden, allocates $12.7 billion for home and community-based services, or HCBS, through 2021. This is truly something to celebrate, finally dedicated funding to support people with disabilities who want to get back to work," end quote. And lastly, of course, we must also continue to do this work through the lenses of intersectionality in order to realize our goals for a more inclusive culture. We know, according to the National Organization for Disability and their work on race and poverty, and the the most recent article by Rachel Blick on the double burden of people of color living with disabilities, that Indigenous communities are 21% more likely to have people with disabilities. African Americans are leading with 22%. followed by white Americans at about 17%. Latinx is at 17.6, a range, from 16.9 to 17.6%, and Asians 14.5. And like many of the programs that we focus on here, including our most recent NYU 100 Women 100 programming, we deeply work and want to understand the impact of these intersections as we think about how disability is defined in terms of health outcomes, mental health diagnoses, and learning challenges, and the disparate impact on various communities and intra-communal challenges within disability communities. If we think about the overlap with the labor force and coming down to 17.9 in 2020 from 19.3 of the employment of persons with disabilities in 2019 at 19.3 from the US Department of Labor, we know we have real challenges in this area of labor. So the new announcement today in USA Today is a good announcement, but we have a lot of work to do. And if we think about the differential impact, particularly with intersections, we know that labor is depressed, particularly for POC populations, women, etc. In this spirit, I would just like to also thank all of our partners and talk about an intersectional group of specific colleagues across NYU who are working each day to advance intersectionality, disability inclusive culture, and access and resources. Our students and faculty and staff advocates, past and present. So there's some I won't be able to thank, but I definitely just want to thank a few. The Moses Center for Student Accessibility and Robin Weiss. Thank you, Robin. Thank you for your partnership and your ongoing work and the service that you provide for students, and to our office. The Provost Office of Disability Inclusion and Accessibility Working Group members, including the co-chairs, Karen Nersessian and Professor Faye Ginsburg. Thank you for the pathways that you've laid and for the tremendous work that you have done, and the members of that committee. We are thankful at NYU for your ongoing work and your partnership. NYU's Center for Disability Studies. Thank you for all of the research and the great work and highlighting so many scholars. Thank you to Chrissy Patton and Steinhardt and the work with the Nest Lab. Thank you to the Office of Equal Opportunity and Kelly Collier Brown for their work around employee accommodation and related training, support, and capacity building. Thank you to Kitty Bridges and the disability accessibility teams. Thank you to Karen Jackson Weaver, Chandani Patel, and Luis Cicernos, and my entire team who've done work to support these efforts, including the Inclusive Pedagogy Seminars, the Disability Inclusion Faculty Toolkit, and the Disability Educational Zones, programs centered on students. Thank you to our Senate representatives and our student and alumni groups. And finally, thank you to Michael John Carley, who has helped to shepherd this program and serves as our part-time disability inclusive culture consultant and supports our disability inclusive culture hub within OGI. And lastly, thank you to our amazing panelists. Now, I know I've spoken for quite some time, but we had to set the stage. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this evening's program, Leah Lattimore. Leah is our Assistant Vice President for Inclusive Global Student Leadership Programs and the Center for Multicultural Education and Programs. Thank you, Leah, and a special thank you to our fantastic student body and all of the work. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. It is such a pleasure to be in conversation with this amazing panel today. And so I'm going to jump in a little bit so we can get right into this incredible conversation. So tonight we're going to discuss the past, present, and future of disability inclusive culture here at NYU, as well as alignments and differences between students and faculty experiences. And to frame a little bit about where we're referencing, I want to offer a partial definition from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC, that says, disability inclusive culture is including people with disabilities in everyday activities and encouraging them to have roles similar to their peers who do not have a disability. It involves more than simply encouraging people. It requires making sure that adequate policies and practices are in effect to create a culture of inclusion. So that's the framework we're going to be referencing, but not the sole framework that will be referenced in this conversation. I am going to introduce our panelists and jump right into the conversation. The first person I'll be introducing is Christina Beck. She is an undergraduate at the School of Professional Studies, pursuing a degree in organizational behavior and change with a minor in child and adolescent mental health. Previous to her injury and returning to school to complete her degree, Christina had a flourishing career in business management in the retail and restaurant industries, where she led with servant leadership, and her superpower was community relations. On her never ending mission to empower others, Christina co founded two international nonprofit organizations, Urban Farming and Urban Farming and Green Bronx Machine. If I slow down, I'll be able to get there, right? At NYU, Christina has been fiercely advocating for students with disabilities, visible, invisible, and chronic illness for over 3 years as co president of the Disability Student Union, as a senator at large, and on multiple committees. Many publications have been written about Christina's projects throughout the years, including publications such as the LA Times, Detroit News, CNN, The Morning Show, and Landscape Design Professional, The News Herald, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and Teen Vogue, just to name a few. Welcome, Christina. Our next panelist that I will introduce is Dr. Maria Rosa Brea, who is a clinical associate professor and the director of the Bilingual Extension Program. And she joined the Department of Communicative Sciences and Disorders at NYU Steinhardt in the fall of 2017. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in the domains of language development, multilingualism, culturally responsive practices, and learning disabilities. Most of her courses involve high-impact practices, including service learning projects. Her dedication to student learning through community service was previously recognized, and she was the recipient of 3 course development grants at the University of South Florida. In 2015, she was the recipient of the USF Provost Outstanding Community Engaged Faculty Award. At NYU, her dedication to student-centered teaching, social justice activism, and community engagement have also been recognized, as she was awarded the 2019-2020 NYU Martin Luther King Jr. Faculty Award. Welcome, Dr. Brea. Our next panelist is Cheyenne Leonard. She is a second-year graduate student at NYU, getting her master's degree in media, culture, and communication. Cheyenne is a former junior Paralympic track athlete and is a current model, actress, writer, consultant, and advocate. She is a fellow of the inaugural Women's E-News Lorene Arbus Accessibility is Fundamental Fellowship, where she writes articles on disability issues. Cheyenne has been a wheelchair user her whole life and is looking to continue her work in the media industry to amplify the voices of underrepresented groups and improve disability representation. Welcome, Cheyenne. And our final panelist is Dr. Chrissy Patton. She is the Vice Dean of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at New York University. Her research examines strength-based practices in inclusive public school settings. She authored a strengths-based frame of reference for individuals on the autism spectrum as a guide for practice, and her work has been recognized with the awarding of AOTA's 2021 Eleanor Clark Slagle Lectureship. Dr. Patton is the principal investigator of the NYU Steinhardt ASD NEST program, an inclusive program for autistic students. She is currently co-PI of an NSF grant entitled Ideas, Inventing, Designing, and Engineering on the Autism Spectrum, that leverages STEM interests and autistic middle school students to help social competence and potential career pathways. Dr. Patton has published extensively and presented nationally and internationally on topics related to examining autism from a strength-based or abilities-based model. Welcome, Dr. Patton. Welcome, welcome. We're going to just jump right into the conversation, and I'm going to direct the first question to Christina and Cheyenne. So the first question is, in a little bit of the framework, is there maybe people who are watching who don't know much about disability inclusive culture or what it means to have a disability? Would you both mind sharing how disability directly impacts your lives? You don't need to disclose your disability, but share your perspective as you feel comfortable. And thinking about particularly, what do you see as long-term and short-term emotional impacts when you're confronted with inaccessibility on a daily basis? So Christina, I'll turn it to you, and then Cheyenne, please join.
So for me, my disability includes a lot of migraines, dizziness, high sensitivity to lights and sounds. And if I am upright or vertical for too long, then it exasperates everything that I have problems with. So I have to take very short periods where I can be in class or walk around. So in New York, if you don't have a place to lay down or sit down for a while and get back to baseline, then I have a very hard problem with that. And when that happens, I start to have trouble with just deciphering things. I can't understand a lot of things. So it can get bad fast if I don't manage it very well. Do you want me to answer all the questions right now or just that one? I'm sorry.
No, it's up to you, however you feel comfortable. Sometimes,
Okay.
however you track it, some folks are like, you know what, I have a track that I want to follow. If you'd like a break, we can certainly come back to you for the second part.
Oh, I can keep going. And part of that is I have a really bad memory, like really, really bad. That was part, all of these disabilities were an impact after an accident for me. So it's stuff that I have to deal with the new part of my life or the new way I am. So I get frustrated very often with myself or with the new way I am. So when I have those barriers, because I want to do more and keep going. So my disability is invisible. So when I walk into a room, people don't see it. And when I interact with them, especially if I'm managing it very well, they say, I don't see a disability. I don't think anything's wrong with you, or I don't think that there's something that you're sick or anything. So when it does happen, or when they do start seeing it, then they get scared and back off, or stop inviting me to things. So, or stop putting me up for positions or asking me to be a part of things. When I am included, or when people can make space for that, it makes me feel amazing, because I'm so used to beating myself up for that or expecting something to go wrong, that it like empowers me and helps me to keep going. One of my disabilities is that weight. I can't lift a lot of stuff. So going, like, a lot of doors are really heavy at NYU. So just some of that can be a barrier, just getting in. So yeah, so I think that was all I had to say.
Well, thank you for that. And I think, for those of you who are joining, certainly within the NYU community, I encourage you to really take to heart some of the elements of the conversation, because I think that we'll talk a little bit towards the end about things that we all can do to support a more disability inclusive culture, and some things you may have heard of and may feel that this is something that is not new to you, and some of it may be surprising, but all of it we can take on as a community. So thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing, Christina. And Cheyenne, please share with us.
Hi, I was born with broken back, so I've always been in a wheelchair. So it's kind of something that I've always been used to, but that doesn't mean that it necessarily gets any better. I think because it is a visible disability, it's difficult within, like, personally, even just leaving my apartment, people stare at me a lot. People ask really rude and invasive questions, there's so many times where I'll go outside and people will stare at me, and then I'm like, is there something on my face? Like, am I in that dream where I went outside naked? Like, what's going on? And then I have to remember, oh, I'm in a wheelchair, and that's not normal for them. For me, it's completely normal, but for society, a lot of society isn't used to that. And so that can really take a toll on your confidence and your self-esteem and the way that you view yourself. And so on an everyday level, that's one of the things that affects me. But also, like, especially in New York, it's so inaccessible for people with mobility issues. There is steps everywhere. There's not curb cuts on every corner. Even just like if like my friends want to go somewhere to a bar or a restaurant or something, a lot of times it's not accessible. And so I have to either get help to get inside or I can't go there like everyone else. And so that feels very exclusive. But also on a bigger level, there's in terms of employment, there's a lot of discrimination just on every level, because my disability is so visible. People make assumptions and discriminate. So it's harder to get employed. But also I was just diagnosed recently with ADHD, which is completely different for me because I'm so used to dealing with a visible disability. So now I'm dealing with something that's invisible. And I don't think I have fully realized all of the effects that it's had on me yet. So I don't think I can fully speak on that, but just so far, I know that it definitely affects me educational wise, because, you know, I think the issue is that society creates these systems that are made for non-disabled people. And so then disabled people a lot of times aren't included, or things aren't created for disabled people. So then, you know, when it comes to education, if, you know, people learn better in different ways. So I think having more options, professors teaching in different ways or doing things differently for different students that need different things is really important. So yeah, those are just some of the ways that I've noticed that my disability has affected me.
Thank you so much for sharing, Cheyenne. And we're going to dig into a little bit what you shared, particularly around, you know, systems and structures and their impact. But something that you said really resonated with me, and just having an understanding around disability and ability status is that it has the potential to shift. And so I think oftentimes when we're having conversations about disabilities and we're having conversations about ability, we have things pictured in our minds or in a very stagnant way. This is how I have classified you, and this is my understanding of your disability, and therefore that's all it is, without taking into account, and Christina, you mentioned it as well, the nuance of what it means to have that lived experience. And so something for us to certainly be mindful of. Thank you again. And Dr. Brea, I'm going to turn to you a little bit because you have an extensive interdisciplinary background, really looking at cognitive neurosciences. And something that I want to ask you is where we see a lot of day-to-day exclusion happening in the lives of people from a disability standpoint, but also folks who are bilingual, and thinking about ostracization in terms of racism and cultural exclusion. Can you just share a little bit around how this has shown up in your research, in your work, and even address how this is now present in the evolution of Zoom?
Certainly, thank you. That was a nice segue, you know, sort of that idea that we have our own frames into how we look, that we bring our own frames into anything that we are observing, interacting with, you know, feeling, sensing. So, you know, when I think about this question, I have to also center my positionality. I am an immigrant in the United States. I came to the United States at the age of 17, learned English here as a young adult, and have been both in positions of great privilege as well as in positions of great subjugation as a result of my different identities. So when I think about then what my field and what my profession, you know, sort of has done well in the terms of these two identity markers, socially constructed identity markers, so that you can see kind of like what my frame is, you know, they've done really well at kind of defining what bilingualism or multilingualism may be, how it comes to fruition, how it is different from being a person who only constructs or builds meaning in one language. It also has done a fairly good job at the linguistic level of suggesting that language and learning are not monolith disabilities, right? That there are these other manifestations, or there's other ways of kind of like interacting with the world from that perspective. And then we get to a long list of where I see the field still needs to go towards. which of course, as we get older, I think we get even more critical about these settings in which we practice. So I think, in my field, a lot of, keep in mind that the context cannot be, divorced, or what I'm providing cannot be divorced from the context, that this field in which I practice and have practiced is 92% dominated by white women. Okay, so they are the knowledge constructors, they are the ones providing the interventions. And so not unlike teaching, right, like pedagogy or the field of teaching, there's a lot of work to be done in the understanding of the world from different lenses or centering different voices, including that disability voice. Okay, I went through an entire program not having a single class that gave me the history of disability justice in this country. Okay, and here I am providing services to individuals with disabilities who are also multilingual. So we can totally avoid the idea that we have a history in this country of erasing some voices, that colonialism is part of all this, but I'm not gonna get into too much theory. Okay, so all of that kind of comes into fruition. And again, I told you my positionality. So here I am, I've been in the subjugated state too, from the standpoint of linguistics. Now, the thing is that we're not these beings with only one identity bubble walking around, right? These identity bubbles that we carry that allow us to be positioned in either a place of privilege or a place of subjugation, just to use the dichotomy here, not that we always have to go to dichotomies, right? Can expand or contract depending upon the context in which we are seen. So even like what some of the other panelists have said, there are certain settings in which their disabilities may be, that disability that is visible, that bubble gets enlarged and that positionality kind of comes to bear. But there are others in which your other, maybe the being a cisgender woman, or maybe me being a Latinx person kind of become a bigger bubble. So I think, what is missing from my field, just to generalize, is sort of this understanding that we are multidimensional when it comes to our identities. And unless we have that lens, and then considering in that there are these systems that are built for people who are white, heteronormative, neurotypical, middle class, with access to some opportunities that other people don't have, we're not going to be able to realize that then we're looking at language from a deficit lens, because we're seeing a person who speaks a language other than English, that is how we're usually called, right? English learners. If we have an accent, that's something that is deviant. Already speaking a language other than English, coming into a school setting, we are disadvantaged. Okay, so that's the linguistic aspect. Now, bring into that the extra identity of disability. Bring into that the extra identity of being racialized. And that creates then a whole different experience within the context of education. So then you have the most disabled students who are racialized tend to be sent for more disciplinary actions, and that females who are Black, who have learning disabilities, end up actually ending in detention, end up being pathologized to the point of incarceration. Okay, so again, I think we need different frames. That is the first step, and that's really high level, right? So I'm giving you sort of from that perspective, different frames in order to understand that we are not just one dimension. Okay. I read this quote. I always collect quotes right before I go into these panels. If disability were imagined as a political identity with material inequities and resistance tied to it, instead of a biological framework, which is the framework used currently in my field. Okay, it is very much a biological framework. The pedagogical response would be different. Okay, so we go back to what Cheyenne, I hope I said your name, Cheyenne, correct me, you can unmute. Okay, was saying about teaching in different ways and seeing learning as sort of different things. So we go to Zoom and we go to what Zoom has done for us. What Zoom has done for us is say, a person can be allowed not to attend class. A person can be allowed to be present with a camera off. A person can be allowed to do an assignment with an additional time. A person can be allowed to maybe not take an exam because we have this over focus and love for assessments that are traditional in nature. So I think that Zoom has allowed us to kind of see that there are possibilities for inclusion that a classroom setting, live setting within traditional academia had not necessarily, faced most of those of us who are academics with.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think, we'll definitely continue to drop resources in the chat, but I think, which we'll talk about, certainly the impact of COVID and the realization of Zoom around, well, now we have to imagine full participation for everyone. And often that creates then pathways for folks who have been historically excluded. And really we should be thinking about, what does that mean? And potentially using that framework to think about other things that we have accepted as quote unquote normal, status quo, what we've always done, and what would it look like if we were to start with the framework of saying, well, is everyone included, and how do we do that? And so, Dr. Patton, I'm going to turn to you because I know you've done extensive work, particularly around autism. And one of the things I greatly appreciate in regards to your research, in regards to the center, is your approach to examining autism from a strengths-based and abilities-based model. And so I would love to hear from you in particular, given some of your research, what you think the literature says about disability inclusive culture. How do we reposition to asset models versus the problem, or viewing people as something to be fixed, or even from that medical disability model that tends to drive a lot of our interventions?
We have to have non-disabled researchers stop doing the research without true, authentic collaboration with disabled people. Number one, first and foremost.
Full stop, period, right?
Full stop, period, mic drop. If you're doing research on disability and you're not disabled and you're not collaborating with disability advocates, you're working in the wrong space. Because your questions will be better, your design will be better, your outcomes will be more relevant to the community that you're studying. So if you look at the research, that's not happening. It's not happening. So that's the first kind of, I think, big transformation. And there's a real divide between this professional and research community. And Maria mentioned some of the things her profession has gotten wrong. We have been wrong. We have gotten so much wrong by following a real medical model that centers the problem in the individual without really being an advocate for a social model and a cultural model of disability that centers it in a more nuanced way in the environment and with what is meaningful to that individual. So we're part of the problem, for a lot of us that are in these professions and fields. And I would posit that none of us here has ever, we do not build our lives on our remediated weaknesses. Not one of us. Yet what do we have? We have systems in place that perpetuate this deficit model by saying you have to go to special ed, and we'll pathologize your difference. We'll even criminalize your difference, as Maria was mentioning. You have to go to therapy, and you have to work on the things every day that are hard for you to do. And then we wonder and we shake our heads when the students with disabilities turn 18 or 21, and they go, well, their post-secondary outcomes are so poor. We've set them up for that. We have totally set them up for that without having a real parallel track and embedded in a strength-based model. And we've listened to the wrong voices, which have been ours as professionals and individuals without disabilities. I'll give you a couple quick examples. Eye contact, because this relates to Zoom. I can show you thousands of eye contact that speech therapists, psychologists, neuropsychologists, OTs have done, special educators have done on how to improve eye contact with autistic individuals. Tons. I could give you the whole list. Okay. What do autistic individuals say? Eye contact is not something that is really meaningful to me. I actually can maybe comprehend better if I'm not looking at you. Eye contact can be overwhelming. Eye contact can be confusing, yet we write goals and we do programs and we really make this all about increasing eye contact. Whole models of intervention are based on increasing eye contact. What have we found out about Zoom? There was a Stanford study that was done that was really interesting that tried to explain Zoom fatigue. And it was by this professor, Jeremy Bailenson, and he has the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And what he found, one of the main reasons why we are all fatigued with Zoom is that excessive amounts of close-up eye contact is highly intense and distracting. So now what do we do with that information? Do we, as in this asset-based versus deficit-based model, do we take that information and say, I've been wrong. I really have gotten this wrong, and I haven't understood this because I haven't talked to the right individuals and collaborated with the right individuals? Or do we as professionals continue to perpetuate these deficit-based models? And I want to say a little bit about this transition into higher ed, because we perpetuate it in higher ed. We then center the problem at the student level. And we say to the student, all right, student, what you have to do now is you have to go register with the Moses Center, and the Moses Center is amazing. You have to go register with the Moses Center. You have to ask for these accommodations, and we have to make sure that we comply with these accommodations, which is like Dr. Coleman was talking about earlier, the compliance model, without even thinking about maybe the system is wrong. And maybe instead of centering the problem within the student, and we've all learned this from Zoom, a student has to go and ask for breaks to move around. A student has to go and ask for a recorded lecture. What if how many of you have sat in Zoom all day and go, I really need to move around, right? How many of you have benefited from going back and listening to a recording, especially if we have all these conferences that are a month long that we now have to go? How many of you have benefited from listening to a recording? Yet we put the onus of disability on that student to go ask for that without saying, why not record all of our lectures? Why not in a class in person say to your group, I know that if you move around, it's not a sign of an intention. It's a sign you're attending to what your body needs. And creating that culture and making that shift is one of, I think, the biggest imperatives that we have as educators in this higher education space.
So many yes moments. Yep, thank you. Absolutely. We will have this recording available, and I really hope that, that this conversation doesn't just become, a moment, but it contributes to the movement again around how we're creating a more inclusive culture here at NYU. And we recognize that this has been open to folks who are not a part of the NYU community, but there are takeaways that can certainly be implemented in different spaces. Thank you all for bringing in questions. I'm seeing them as they're, coming in. And please continue to do so. And so something that I want to think about in terms of how we're positioning and framing disability inclusive culture, not only again from the problem or from, again, as you mentioned, Dr. Patton, that medical model. I am curious if folks have thoughts, and this will be an open question, in regards to some things that, whether they're best practices that we're seeing in culture shifts that can be implemented in multiple spaces. Right. And so Zoom, for example, is one, captioning is another, but what are some things that we could offer that you've either studied or benefited from that have removed the onus from the individual to truly engage in an inclusive space?
I don't want to, I was just talking, so I don't want to jump in if someone else has something to say. But I think recording 100%, and I don't know why we're afraid to do that. And we're afraid to kind of make that a natural part of what an educator does. And we can no longer say we don't know how to do that. Zoom has pushed us into a different space, right? And, to Cheyenne's point about inaccessibility, do we have the flexibility when we know it's even more inaccessible this city when it snows? Do we have the flexibility to let students attend virtually, and which could meet their accessibility needs, or do we create these structures that are continue to be rigid in a way that really doesn't have it be our first thought, and it's our kind of not even our last thought? We don't even think of it. So how can we begin to be proactive in thinking about how can I make my class more accessible to all, in way, and I think, we've begun to do that in so many ways, but we've got to remember, like Maria had said, so many intersectional ways. How do we do this in a way that really speaks to the complex nature of intersectionality around disability? because we've got to be better. We've got to do this better. We have to. And it's not going to be solved. And I think universities have typically relied on it being solved by the disability center, which is the special ed model. It's the special ed model of, if I have a paraprofessional assigned to my student with a disability, then I don't have to deal with them. And how can we embed this in a more systematic cultural response?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn this next question to both Christina and Cheyenne. And as both of you are activists and have advocated in different spaces for students in particular, what are some things that that are happening or that you would like us to champion in regards to supporting whether students and employees with accommodations or providing more opportunities for support, particularly for students outside of or inclusive of the Moses Center?
I can take that one really quick before Cheyenne talks. So recently I wrote a letter of support and put it through student government, and it was passed unanimously. Yay! And it was all based on changing to an asset-based model at NYU. And that is from my lived experience of the challenges of asking for accommodations and how you start to feel like you're the problem because you have to constantly ask for things, even though people already know your accommodations or had been told about your accommodations. So I really think that people can read that obviously on their own, but just talk to people. And especially if they disclose their disability, to listen to them, and then just allow space for students to speak, because many students start off as saying that they're advocates, and then eventually, once they feel comfortable, will disclose that they have disabilities. And it's amazing, in a room, you think that there's only 2 people that have disabilities because they're the only people who initially disclose. But eventually you'll find out that half the people in the room either had a disability, have one now, or somebody very close to them has one, sometimes even more than that. So I just think listening to the people that have those identities and reacting to it. If somebody tells you something, you should listen to that. And when you act on that, you make them feel valued. You make them feel as though their voice is valued. And that will make them want to interact more and be more successful.
And to add on to what you said, Christina, I think it's really crucial that disabled people are included in every aspect of not just disability things, but everything, because that's why there's all these inaccessibility issues, because disabled people aren't talked to in every aspect. If there's an off-campus event for NYU, especially in New York, you've got to make sure that the venue or the place that the event is being held is accessible to all students, and not just assume that, oh, well, we don't have anyone in our program who is disabled. You need to always assume that there's going to be disabled people, whether there is or not, and really include disabled people because, like what was said earlier, a lot of times it's non-disabled people who are coming up with this research and this infrastructure, and it's not consulting disabled people and asking them, hey, what actually would work best for you? And that's how we're going to get the most inclusive culture, not even just for disabled people, but for everyone. When you look at curb cuts, for example, the little ramps on the side of sidewalks, that's great for wheelchair users and people with walkers and everything, but it's also great for everyone, for parents with strollers, for people who are traveling and they have luggage. Making things more inclusive and accessible is going to help everyone. But I think there's kind of this idea that it's only for disabled people, and it's not. But I think disabled people have really great ideas, and they're the ones who know what's best for them. So that's who should be consulted, and in every aspect.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. we are getting close to time. If it's okay, we're going to go to about 7:05. I'm going to, round robin a few questions and, target a few folks. I'll say your name and ask if you could respond and give you a second to prepare. And for our audience, again, we wanted to make this conversation about, you as well. So please engage in the chat, send your questions before we wrap up. My first targeted question is going to be to Dr. Brea. You spoke at the beginning a little bit around like some of these intersections. There was a question that came in that said, how do we also think about or address the intersection of gender with disability and the impact that that has on different communities? I would love for you to take that question. And then Dr. Patton, I would love for you to take the question in regards to thinking about a trend, if there is one, between tenured professors potentially being less attentive to accessibility needs within students. And then I'll hit you both, Christina and Cheyenne, on the back end with additional questions.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in thinking about frames, critical race theory and Crenshaw's work on intersectionality cannot be ignored. And as I briefly mentioned, and I know we're near at time too, and I want to make sure that my fellow panelists have time to answer other questions. Even in regards to identification of disabilities, there tends to be girls, for example, with autism tend to fall through the cracks, right? So there's even that as an example of this idea of that. And then if you have, in addition to the autism, you also have multilingualism. So then there's this wait and see phenomenon too, because people are not sure if the different development is due to a difference or a disability, right? So that's like always the big question that people ask. So again, it's always this framing of othering instead of considering that there are these multiple intersections that take place. That's at the point of kind of identification. But even with access, as I mentioned before, just the criminalization of particularly Black females within school settings with regard to disciplining, especially those females who have language and learning disabilities that are invisible, right, to most people until there's something that seems to be marked, as different for them. So, and then that as codified under the idea of the pragmatics of obedience. Like, what is it and how do you behave in a school and how are you supposed to be? Because if you're a person of color who raises their voice, or a woman of color who raises, or particularly a Black woman who raises their voice, then you're considered an angry Black person, right? Or an angry Latina person, or angry Latina is how I should say it, Latinx. So thinking about that, none of these things kind of happen in a vacuum. I don't know if I did a good job, but that was like a 2-minute summary.
Right. And so here's the thing. And, again, I keep interjecting and putting myself in the midst of this, but I think, something that is also missed is that this has been a long and extensive conversation. And so, there's tons of research. And again, we're going to uplift some of the resources in the community. Folks have been sounding the alarm about some of the issues that we're talking about, as well as offering suggestions and interventions and solutions to some of the issues that we've faced structurally and systemically. And so while we, yes, talk about, personal accountability, this is a part of a larger systemic challenge that we're seeing that's impacting folks. And so Dr. Patton, I'll toss it to you and thoughts around who
tenured versus adjunct faculty. Love it. Maria's like, glad I didn't get that question. No, I actually think I have a couple thoughts on this because we've had a lot of experiences. We started the NYU Connections program in conjunction with the Moses Center that supports autistic students here at NYU, both undergrad and grad. And part of what we have done is do a lot of training, and we've done a lot of training with faculty. And we've trained at Tisch, at Tandon, we've trained residence life staff, university advisors. I know I'm missing some, but part of it was really to kind of do this cultural shift, to have to train people to really look at this differently. And I will say that I've met some incredibly amazing tenured professors once exposed to these ideas, and it's just because they have students that they're really trying to help. And so I don't think it's a tenure versus adjunct distinction. I think it's a engaged educator versus non-engaged educator distinction, which you can find at any and all levels, right? I do think that one thing that I'm concerned in my role as vice dean is an adjunct gap. And by that, I mean, how do we make sure that we really are including adjuncts in a lot of this professional development that we're trying to do? And it's tricky, right? So how do we make sure that they're part of the fabric of some of these movements and initiatives that we're doing that they may often not hear about, or they may not often not be connected to. So that's on us to do that, right? So I think it's more, engaged versus non-engaged. We also have to recognize that we probably have 7 or maybe 8 generations on this campus, if you're looking at generations by decade. And those are very different conceptualizations of disability justice, for example, or disability rights, or really. So to me, it's really more about exposure, and really integration and include in a radical inclusive way, and like interrogating these systems that we are all a part of, to say, if I'm fighting for inclusion, what does the system look that I'm fighting to get into? And it may not be the right system, that it may need to be a radical shifts.
Thank you so much. Sorry, you may be picking up some outside noise. Brooklyn in the summer, represent. So, Cheyenne and Christina, I'm going to give you both the last word on this. When you were invited to speak on a panel about disability inclusive culture at NYU, what is something that you wanted this audience to take away? So, using this platform, we're going to certainly amplify across OGI channels. What is something that you want as a takeaway to this community who is hearing you, your experiences, your peers, a takeaway that you wanted folks to have in regards to this conversation?
I would say that disability comes in many different forms. And so, there needs to be more education on it, because I think a lot of people don't think that I think a lot of people think it's a very segregated community, but it's not. It's very integrated into everyone's community and societies. And to just think about that, and maybe try to think about how you can help other disabled people, and realize that disability isn't one thing. It comes in many different looks, many different forms, and it is likely in a lot of your circles.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm going to put that plug in for Cheyenne, who has been doing some incredible writing around representation in media. So please, I'll drop her link in the chat where you can read up about some of the great things that she shared. And Christina.
Ooh, this is such a hard question. I guess what I would like people to know is that just because the system has not been built for people with disabilities, and just because nobody talks about it, doesn't mean that disabled people aren't there. They just feel like they are silenced, and you don't want them there. But they're fighting to be there, and they're fighting to show you their superpowers and what they are capable of. And if they're supported, they will help you be successful, and they will be widely successful. So just imagine the world that we could have if we were inclusive.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, again, and Christina, I'm going to drop in the link to the article where you were referencing the Chronicle of Higher Education, that I do think if we're talking about inclusion and we're talking about a better way forward, that it requires us to be truly inclusive of everyone in all communities. And I know folks are probably thinking, well, how and why? And that's why you're going to continue to attend panels and read and talk to people and do this work in collaboration. There's not one single response, but there are absolutely a number of things that we can do together. And so thank you all for joining this panel. Thank you for sharing. I think so many things I've written down, again, pages of notes in regards to all that was shared here. It's been so rich and in such a in so many ways, many tangible things were shared, so that all of us, I charge every person who was listening to this conversation, who will be listening to this conversation, that there were many things that we could be doing, particularly on this campus and certainly in different spaces together, whether you are a student, an administrator, a faculty member, a researcher, postdoc, whatever your position is here at this institution, there are things that we can do together. And so I, again, want to give a thank you to our co-sponsors, the Moses Center for Student Accessibility, NYU Center for Disability Studies, all of the scholars who have contributed to this field of research and this work that we continue to build upon. And I hope that we can continue this conversation. And finally, thank you again to Michael John Carley, who was instrumental in envisioning this program, formulating questions, bringing us all together, and charging us to continually think about what disability inclusive culture means for us here at NYU. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Thank you to all the staff within the Office of Global Inclusion. We wouldn't have been able to have a successful program without you, and hope to engage you all in this work very soon.